I never intended to share this story, yet the burden of what transpired at Stygian Point Penitentiary gnaws at me like a corrosive force, and perhaps pouring it into words offers the only chance to unburden what remains of my fractured self. My name is Jovek, or at least it was before everything unraveled, and for years I existed within the confines of Oak Haven State Penitentiary, a grim fortress where the damp concrete walls and the relentless clanging of iron bars shaped my daily reality. There, I thrived as a hardened smuggler, a man who survived by keeping his eyes sharp and his lips sealed, navigating the unwritten codes and savage pecking order that governed the inmates' lives. Oak Haven stood as a decaying, overcrowded relic, perpetually steeped in the stench of rust and hopelessness, but its predictability provided a twisted comfort. Knowing who to trust, who to steer clear of, and how to fade into the shadows became second nature to me. All of that shifted irreversibly on a day that now blurs in my recollection, when I found myself in my cell, tracing the familiar cracks in the ceiling for what might have been the 1,000th time, only to be interrupted by the arrival of C.O. Nimrud, a guard unlike any other I'd encountered. He was a hulking figure, his bulk undeniable, yet he carried an eerie stillness that seemed to drain the vitality from the air around him, his eyes unsettling in their misalignment, as though they operated independently of his body's motions. When he spoke, his voice rumbled low and guttural, delivering the words, "Jovek, you're being transferred to a facility better suited to your risk profile," with a finality that allowed no room for questions, accompanied only by the metallic clink of handcuffs being readied. In Oak Haven, orders were absolute, and resistance was futile, yet something in his tone twisted my gut with unease, a sensation I couldn't shake as the reality of my departure sank in. That same day introduced me to Lysander, a jittery young man, barely into his 20s I'd guess, whose trembling hands and darting rabbit-like eyes betrayed his inexperience in this brutal world. Caught for some petty offense, perhaps fraud or another crime that left his hands clean, he was painfully out of place, clinging to a fragile glimmer of hope or naive belief in something greater, a stark contrast to the cynicism that had long calcified within me after years of witnessing too much. They shoved us together into the back of a windowless van, where Lysander muttered something about divine intervention under his breath, prompting me to roll my eyes and fixate instead on the creaking metal beneath my boots as the vehicle lurched into motion. The journey began like any routine transfer, the engine's labored growl, the stifling heat pressing against us, and the faint reek of stale gasoline permeating the air. But it wasn't long before an unsettling strangeness crept in, stretching the hours far beyond what any trip to a nearby state prison should have demanded. Silence dominated the van's interior, broken only by Lysander's anxious breaths and the intermittent static crackling from the driver's radio, which seemed to malfunction in fits and starts, while outside, I could swear I detected faint, deep hums. Not the rush of passing cars or the whistle of wind, but a resonant drone that grated against my senses. I tried to dismiss it, focusing on the familiar rhythms of confinement, yet with every mile, an unshakable dread grew, whispering that we were being ferried toward a place beyond the edges of the world I understood. Nimrud didn't take the wheel. He sat rigid in the passenger seat, statue-like, while another guard, whose face I never quite caught, steered us onward, leaving me to mentally chart the roads from my smuggling days, though none of my calculations aligned with our path. Lysander, meanwhile, resorted to murmuring soft prayers, a habit that irritated me more than it soothed, until he ventured to ask, his voice nearly lost beneath the engine's drone, whether I'd ever heard of Stygian Point, a name I didn't recognize, but one that carried an ominous weight I instinctively recoiled from tasting. That shadow of foreboding deepened throughout the journey, fueled not just by the endless duration or the peculiar noises, but by a visceral certainty that we were slipping beyond the boundaries of the reality I'd mastered, where survival hinged on trades, favors, and calculated silences, skills that felt useless in the confines of that van. Glancing once through the grate separating us from the front, I caught Nimrud's head turning slowly, his disjointed gaze locking onto mine without a word, confirming in that mute exchange that whatever awaited us was no mere change of scenery. When the van finally shuddered to a halt, the silence that descended felt heavier than the engine's roar ever had, and as the rear doors groaned open, a rush of frigid air flooded in, tinged with an electric hum that seemed to emanate from every direction. Nimrud hauled us out with little ceremony, revealing Stygian Point Penitentiary in all its menacing grandeur. A towering monolith of concrete thrusting upward against a barren sky, its angles so jarring they strained the eyes, as though its architect had defied the laws of geometry itself. No signs of civilization surrounded it, no roads, no towns, just an endless expanse of desolation that might have been desert or jagged peaks, impossible to discern in the oppressive gloom. And the structure seemed to devour the light around, it a faint tremor rippling through the ground beneath my feet. Lysander stood frozen beside me, his lips moving soundlessly in what I assumed was another futile prayer, while I felt something stir within me. Not hope, but the raw, unyielding tenacity of a man who'd clawed through worse odds before. As Nimrud shoved us toward the entrance, I stole a glance back at the van, where the driver remained seated, his head cocked at an unnatural angle, leaving me uncertain whether he still drew breath or had become a casualty of whatever force had brought us here, though a gut instinct warned that I might soon envy his fate. Stygian Point wasn't merely a prison. It loomed as a living mausoleum, poised to engulf us whole, and deep within me, I understood that escaping it would demand far more than the cunning that had carried me through Oak Haven's trials. When the penitentiary's massive doors parted, the sound they unleashed resembled the anguished howl of a wounded beast. A deep, reverberating groan that rolled through the colossal framework and faded into the lifeless void encircling us, while Nimrud propelled Lysander and me inside with hands that felt unnaturally unyielding, the air shifting instantly into something thick and charged, alive with that same electric hum I'd sensed outside, now intensified as it danced along the rough, concrete walls. The interior unfolded as a brutalist nightmare, its corridors stretching into disorienting angles that defied logic, as though designed by someone who'd abandoned the principles of spatial coherence. And when I tilted my head upward, I glimpsed exposed beams overhead, yet their edges curved in ways that confounded my vision, forcing my eyes to surrender any attempt at comprehension. No welcoming party awaited us. No guards barked commands or peered through iron grates. Instead, an oppressive stillness reigned, interrupted only by that relentless hum growing more pronounced with every step we took, as Nimrud guided us down, a narrow passage toward a chamber that resembled an abandoned storeroom, its walls streaked with damp stains and a lone metal table dominating the center. Surrounding her lay a collection of yellowish papers adorned with unfamiliar symbols, jagged lines and sweeping curves that resembled cryptic codes more than any alphabet I'd ever encountered. With a low grunt, he gestured toward the documents. Before retreating, the sharp click of the lock echoing as he secured the door behind him, leaving that metallic sound as the only trace of humanity we'd experienced for some time. Lysander, ever the cautious one, approached the table first, his trembling fingers hovering over the pages before he finally grasped them, his voice quivering as he asked what they were. A question laced with dread that suggested he already suspected. The answer would be something he'd rather not hear. Taking one of the sheets myself, I read aloud in an attempt to steady my nerves, reciting words that carried a detached, clinical tone, yet hinted at something deeply unsettling, as though penned by an entity that only vaguely grasped how human minds operated. Personnel designated as inactive possess no cognitive authority, meaning all verbal instructions should be disregarded, and extended visual engagement is to be avoided. The phrasing was chilling in its precision, yet beneath its formality lurked an oddity that gnawed at me, and as I pressed on, the text grew stranger still. Should a crimson alert be issued, immediate retreat to assigned containment zones is mandatory, as prolonged exposure will lead to reassignment of status. That word, reassignment, hung heavily in the air between us, a vague yet ominous signal that offered no clarity while somehow conveying far more than we were ready to process. Before we could fully grapple with its implications, a harsh screech pierced the silence, erupting from a rusted intercom bolted to the wall through which a voice crackled, distorted by layers of static as if it had been etched onto a worn, fraying tape, and announced with mechanical indifference that access to the therapeutic processing wing was limited to personnel of a certain clearance level, adding that any unsanctioned entry would trigger a cleansing procedure. Lysander recoiled, his eyes widening in alarm, while I wrestled with the chilling ambiguity of what cleansing might entail in a place like this, my mind racing to decode the term as the voice continued its relentless recitation, declaring that a figure known as the Proctor conducted nightly rounds at unpredictable intervals, and detection during these sweeps would prove fatal. The finality of that word, fatal, struck like a verdict delivered in the dry, dispassionate language of an instruction manual, leaving no room for misinterpretation. And as I glanced at Lysander, hoping for some reaction to anchor me, he stood, motionless, clutching the papers tightly as though they might shield him from the reality closing in around us. The voice concluded its message with a directive to report any structural irregularities to an assigned overseer, then abruptly fell silent, prompting me to survey our surroundings more closely, where I noticed for the first time that the walls seemed uneven, crudely formed, as if molded by unsteady hands, while the lines that should have been straight wavered subtly, and the ceiling appeared to press closer than it had when we'd first arrived. Though I tried to dismiss it as exhaustion from our arduous journey playing tricks on my perception, a persistent hum in the air contradicted that comforting lie, and just as I began to question my senses, the sound of footsteps reached us. Not the steady tread of a guard's boots, but an erratic, halting shuffle, like someone taking their first clumsy steps. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a figure that defied easy classification. Calling it a guard felt overly generous, for while it wore a tattered gray uniform, its face was a featureless expanse, a smooth, waxy surface where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, as though the flesh had been sculpted improperly and left to harden. This being stood there, its head cocked at an unnatural angle, before lurching forward with stumbling, uneven strides until it paused near the far wall, prompting Lysander to emit a strangled gasp, while a cold dread coursed through my veins. The word inactive slipping from my lips as I recalled the rules we'd just read. Though it didn't turn toward us, how could it? Its mere presence pressed heavily against the room, and after a moment of stillness, it jerked its head sharply, as if responding to a sound beyond our hearing, emitting a low, garbled static, not unlike a poorly tuned radio before shuffling back out into the corridor as swiftly as it had appeared. Staring at the now open doorway, my heart hammered against my ribcage, while Lysander sank to the floor, the papers scattering around him as he whispered a question about what we'd just witnessed, though I had no answer to offer, only a growing certainty that those rules were no mere formality. They were our fragile lifeline in a place harboring secrets far beyond our understanding. In that moment, the reality of Stygian Point crystallized around us like newly set concrete, revealing itself not just as a structure but as something alive, observant, and patient. Its imperfections not flaws, but deliberate features woven into its very essence. Gathering the fallen papers, I tucked them into my pocket, resolved to commit every word to memory, knowing that if we were to endure this place, we'd need to master its bizarre dictates, no matter how irrational they seemed, though deep within. Me stirred the inescapable realization that arriving at Stygian Point hadn't marked the start of a mere confinement. It had thrust us into a nightmare I'd never dared to imagine possible. From that initial encounter with the inactive, time within Stygian Point began to blur into an indefinable haze, lacking the clear boundaries of days, as the absence of windows and natural light left us with only the ceaseless drone of machinery and flickering fluorescent bulbs that seemed to pulse faintly, almost as if they were alive. Lysander and I were soon separated into individual cells, close enough that I could hear his constant muttering, a blend of desperate prayers and stifled groans he couldn't suppress, while the rules from those papers became our warped guidebook. Words I recited silently in an effort to unravel the nature of this place, though each attempt to probe deeper only seemed to destabilize the ground beneath us further. Our first hint of the true fracture in this reality emerged when we ventured beyond our cells, discovering corridors that twisted into illogical configurations, doors opening onto blank walls, staircases that appeared to ascend and descend simultaneously, until, during one such exploration, we stumbled upon a sealed chamber, which we forced open using a shard of metal pried from a cot, revealing an interior lined with restraint chairs, unlike anything I'd seen in depictions of executions. They're thick, cables snaking toward helmets bristling with electrodes, and walls etched with frantic claw marks that suggested someone had fought desperately to escape. Lysander's face drained of color as we stood there, my own stomach churning at the thought of what had been confined in those seats. And it wasn't long before we encountered the remains. First a guard, or what we assumed had been one, sprawled in a neglected hallway, his shredded uniform barely clinging to a body that seemed melded into the floor, as if the concrete had liquefied and then solidified around him. His exposed bones gleaming with an odd, almost translucent sheen that hinted at some internal transformation. Later we found another figure, a prisoner perhaps, his head twisted at an angle no human neck could sustain, his skin stretched taut over a form that no longer seemed entirely human. Each discovery deepening the sense that Stygian Point wasn't merely a facility, but a living entity, one that consumed and reshaped those within its grasp, leaving us to wonder how long we could resist its influence before we, too, became part of its grotesque design. Lysander retched violently right there on the floor, and I found myself unable to tear my eyes away, desperately trying to push aside the gnawing dread about what this horrifying moment might signify for whatever future we still clung to in this forsaken place. All around us, the inactive shuffled through the shadows, their movements jerky and unnatural like marionettes with half their strings severed, silent and unresponsive unless provoked. An action I'd learned the hard way too. A void after one brushed past me so closely that the air seemed to thicken, leaving behind a low, grating hum that lingered in my skull for hours. They appeared to trace predetermined paths through the corridors, almost as though adhering to some unseen timetable. Yet occasionally they'd halt without warning, their featureless heads swiveling toward arbitrary points in the gloom before, resuming their eerie march. Lysander speculated that these were guards who'd somehow malfunctioned in their duties, but I was beginning to harbor a darker suspicion, that they were the discarded remnants of experiments tied to something far larger and more sinister unfolding within these walls. Then the Carmesim alert shattered our fragile respite, catching us as we huddled in an abandoned cell where we'd hoped to steal a moment's rest, only for the dim, grimy light to give way to a throbbing crimson glow that pulsed through the space, accompanied by a rising drone that escalated into a deafening roar, setting my teeth on edge. The rules we'd been given instructed us to seek containment during such an event, but with no clearly marked safe zone in sight, we bolted. Instead, for the deepest shadow we could find, crouching behind a stack of moldy mattresses that reeked of decay and neglect. It was there, in that suffocating darkness, that we first heard the approach. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoing through the halls, starkly distinct from the erratic stumbles of the inactive, and when I peeked through a gap in our makeshift barricade, I glimpsed the sanitation teams, figures clad in sleek, sealed black suits, wielding strange weapons that emitted no sound as they methodically felled the wandering husks with chilling precision. Our desperate flight from that scene propelled us into the mistake that would seal our fate, for in our panic we dashed down an unfamiliar corridor, only to find ourselves stumbling into the therapeutic processing wing before we could reconsider our path, the door hanging slightly open as if beckoning us despite the rule's stern warnings ringing in my mind. With the relentless tread of the sanitation team still reverberating behind us, retreat was no longer an option, and as we crossed the threshold, the air grew thick and damp, infused with a sharp metallic tang that coated my throat like rust. Along the walls stood rows of glass tanks, some shattered into jagged shards while others held murky liquids where indistinct shapes drifted. Bodies that were human or nearly so, their limbs contorted into grotesque angles, their unblinking eyes seeming to track our every move through the gloom. In one corner, a stretcher cradled a figure that still twitched faintly, strapped down to the metal frame, its skeletal fingers scraping the floor in a slow, nauseating rhythm that made my stomach churn. It was amidst this macabre tableau that Nimrud emerged once more, stepping from the shadows at the far end of the room, though the quiet guard who'd overseen our transfer was gone, replaced by something altogether different. His eyes now gleamed with an unnatural greenish sheen, and when he spoke, his voice rasped with a layered, guttural quality that sent shivers racing down my spine, declaring with grim certainty that we had no business being there. He lunged toward us with a speed that defied his bulky frame, and I barely managed to twist out of his grasp as Lysander seized a rusted surgical instrument from a nearby tray, a wickedly curved blade that looked more suited to harm than healing, and drove it deep into Nimrud's chest with a sickening crunch. The guard crumpled to the ground, But not before I snatched an access card from his belt, my fingers brushing against the black, syrupy blood that oozed from the wound. A substance, so far removed from anything human that it cemented my growing realization of the horrors we'd stumbled into. That brutal encounter altered everything we thought we knew, and armed with the pilfered card and the gore-streaked tool, we understood that remaining idle was no longer a viable choice, especially as the incessant ringing in the walls seemed to swell, urging us forward, or perhaps hurting us, like the building itself had taken an active role in our unfolding nightmare. The grotesque sights we'd witnessed in that wing were merely the opening notes of a larger, more terrifying symphony, fragments of a mystery I had no desire to unravel yet could no longer turn away from, with the Karmasim alert, the inactive, the sanitation teams, and Proctor all hinting at a vast awakening force buried within the heart of Stygian Point. Foolish and headstrong as we were, we'd plunged ourselves straight into the core of this abyss, with no inkling of what awaited us beyond the next shadowed turn. Navigating the twisting corridors of Stygian Point felt like clawing our way out of a dream determined to hold us captive. And after ending Nimrod's unnatural existence, Lysander and I pressed onward, the access card still warm in my grip. The surgical tool's metal slick with his dark blood clutched tightly in his trembling hand. The ringing in the walls had swelled into a thunderous clamor, and the lights flickered wildly overhead, casting shadows that danced and shifted as if possessed of their own volition, while the very layout of the place seemed to warp around us. Doors, vanishing where they'd once stood, passages bending into impossible spirals that defied all sense of direction. Driven by raw instinct, we eventually stumbled into the garage, a cavernous expanse littered with the husks of broken vans and rusted machinery, offering what seemed like our sole chance at escape. Though the moment we crossed its threshold, the air grew oppressively thick, charged with a harsh static that stabbed at my ears like needles. Then Proctor appeared before us, a towering skeletal figure that bore no resemblance to anything human, its elongated limbs stretching far beyond natural limits, its parchment-like skin stretched taut over jutting bones, and its face, a shifting, featureless mass, studded with countless tiny ember-like eyes that glowed with malevolent intent. When it spoke, no words emerged, only a piercing burst of static that seared through my mind like fire, and Lysander cried out in agony, the tool slipping from his grasp as he clutched his head and sank to his knees under the assault. The creature moved with terrifying swiftness despite its grotesque form, its arms unfurling like tendrils to seize him, and without a moment's thought, I wrenched a fire extinguisher from the wall and hurled it with all my strength, striking what I hoped was its chest, the canister bursting in a blinding cloud of white powder that forced Proctor to recoil, its static faltering just long enough for Lysander to stagger to his feet, his face contorted with pain, but his resolve unbroken. Seizing the tool once more, Lysander darted to one side, shouting hoarsely for me to locate the van while he drew the creature's attention, and as Proctor whirled toward him with jerky, inhuman precision, I sprinted to the corner where a transport vehicle, possibly the very one that had delivered us to this hell, sat abandoned. Inside, the driver's corpse slumped over the wheel, his body shriveled and desiccated, etched with bizarre symbols carved into his leathery skin as though something had drained every ounce of life from him. And with trembling hands, I jammed Nimrod's card into a panel beside the garage door, silently pleading for it to work as the sounds of Lysander's desperate struggle, metal clashing against metal, rang out behind me. Proctor proved unrelenting, seizing Lysander by the arm and flinging him into a pile of crates with a bone-shattering crash. Yet even with his arm now dangling uselessly at his side, he crawled toward the fallen extinguisher, unleashing another blast of powder into the creature's face to buy me precious seconds. Those fleeting moments allowed me to fish the keys from the dead driver's pocket and coax the engine to life. Though Proctor's glowing eyes soon fixed on me, the static surging back with renewed fury, until Lysander's incoherent yell cut through the chaos as he plunged the tool into a nearby fuel tank, sending gasoline gushing across the floor in a glistening flood, a signal I understood all too well, even as my heart clenched with the weight of what it might cost us. I twisted the steering wheel with a sharp jerk and floored the accelerator toward Proctor, the van's bumper slamming into him with a force that reverberated through the vehicle like a collision with an unyielding iron wall, causing the creature to stagger, yet refuse to collapse entirely. Lysander, coughing up blood in ragged spurts, clung to me with a desperate grip, clutching the tool in his hands as if it were a makeshift spear, his voice breaking through the chaos as he shouted, "Go!" before summoning one final burst of strength to hurl the weapon at Proctor, aiming for a glowing spot on his chest that shimmered like an implant or some exposed core. The blade struck true, and from Proctor erupted a noise that defied description, not a sound in any conventional sense, but a hollow void that seemed to devour the air around us, creating an unsettling vacuum in its wake. Seizing the fleeting opportunity, I slammed my foot harder against the gas pedal, the van's engine roaring to life as I hauled Lysander into the passenger seat beside me, his body slumping against the worn upholstery while Proctor dropped too, his knees, his form convulsing violently as something small and metallic clattered from him to the ground, a device I snatched up swiftly before yanking the door shut behind us. The garage door groaned under protest, its gears grinding as it slid open with the swipe of a card, though Proctor, undeterred, continued to twitch and reach for us with elongated, grasping arms that stretched unnaturally in our direction. Undaunted, I rammed the van into the door, the metal screeching in defiance as we forced our way through the narrowing gap, emerging at last into the open air just as the main gate buckled and gave way with a thunderous crash beneath the vehicle's relentless momentum. Alarms blared in a deafening cacophony, and for a fleeting moment, I could have sworn I glimpsed shadowy figures perched atop the watchtower, silhouettes too still, too wrong, but the urgency of our escape left no room for a second glance as I pressed onward without pause. Miles later, the van sputtered to a halt on a desolate stretch of road, its engine choking out its final gasps before succumbing to silence, the stillness that followed draping over us like a heavy shroud, broken only by the faint, labored breathing of Lysander, who clung to life beside me, his arms shattered, his face ashen, his chest heaving with shallow, uneven breaths. Glancing at him, I searched for words to bridge the gap between us, some reassurance or explanation. But before I could speak, a low, almost imperceptible hum emanated from him, chilling me to the core as I recognized it as the same electric drone that had haunted us since Stygian Point, a sound that coiled around my nerves like a predator lying in wait. My blood ran cold with the realization that Proctor might be dead, or at least incapacitated. Yet whatever malevolence that place harbored still lingered within us, perhaps within him most of all, suggesting that while the battle had ended, the true nightmare was only beginning to unfurl its tendrils around us. The van had come to rest on a road that stretched into an endless void, its engine offering one last shuddering sigh before falling silent, leaving us enveloped in a quiet so profound it seemed to press against my eardrums, interrupted only by the persistent tinnitus escaping Lysander, now sharper, more defined, a cruel reverberation of Stygian Point's enduring echo. He slumped in the passenger seat, his broken arm dangling at an awkward angle, his breaths irregular and ragged as beads of sweat traced paths down his graying face, while I clutched the metallic device I'd retrieved from Proctor, a strange, unfamiliar piece that felt alien in my grasp, struggling to comprehend what we had unleashed or whether we had truly escaped anything at all. Peering through the van's cracked window, I saw only a vast, dark sky that swallowed any trace of stars or horizon, amplifying the sense of isolation that clung to us after our chaotic flight, marked by the clamor of alarms and the wrenching groan of the main gate as it yielded to the van's weight. In that moment of crossing, I'd caught a glimpse of figures in the watchtower, tall, emaciated shapes that moved with an eerie stillness, unlike anything human. But panic had propelled me forward, leaving no time to dwell on the sight until now, when the full weight of our escape crashed down upon me like a slab of unforgiving concrete, whispering that Stygian Point was not the sort of place that simply released its hold. Lysander's groan, a hoarse rasp that snapped me back to the present, pulled my attention to him as he murmured, "Jovek." Through half-open eyes glazed with pain and something deeper, a faint luminescence that hadn't been there before, unsettling in its unfamiliarity. Reaching for a crumpled water bottle discarded on the van's floor, I tried to coax him to drink, but he brushed it away with a feeble hand, too weak to muster real resistance, while the buzzing from him grew, louder, pulsing in waves that I could feel resonating in my chest, a sensation that gnawed at my resolve. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice faltering as if clinging to the edge of consciousness. And indeed I did. Every note of that sound screaming that whatever had transpired back there was far from over, its tendrils still tightening around us. Stepping. Out of the van, my boots sank into the cracked, dry earth of the road as I circled the vehicle, scanning the darkness for any sign of life or pursuit. My gaze inevitably drawn to the original driver, still slumped behind the wheel, his desiccated, body rigid and etched with strange, indecipherable symbols, as if something had hollowed him out from within. On impulse, I touched the corpse, and its brittle skin crumbled to dust beneath my fingertips, releasing a sharp, acrid stench that stung my nostrils, a grim reminder of the unnatural forces at play, amplified by the sudden warmth of the device. In my hand, which vibrated faintly as if attuned to Lysander's persistent hum, hinting that it was more than a mere tool, something alive, something I couldn't yet fathom. Returning to the driver's seat, I slammed the door shut with a force born of frustration and fear, my mind racing as I pieced together our escape. The garage breached, Proctor felled, the gate smashed, only to question what it had all been. For, especially as Lysander's condition deteriorated beside me, his arms swelling grotesquely, dark veins creeping up his neck like a spreading infection. "Don't leave me here," he whispered, his eyes pleading yet shadowed by something that made me hesitate. A glint that suggested the tinnitus wasn't merely a sound, but a mark. A warning branded into him by Stygian Point, and perhaps into me as well. An indelible scar from a place that refused to let go. Gripping the surgical tool we'd used against Proctor, its blade still streaked with dried blood, I held it tightly, uncertain whether it was a weapon to protect myself or a means to end the horror unfolding before me as the road stretched endlessly into a darkness that swallowed the world around us, leaving only the cuts and bruises on my body, the bone-deep exhaustion, and the relentless sound from Lysander to keep me tethered to reality. He coughed again, a wet, guttural noise that echoed in the confined space, and when he turned his head toward me, I saw his eyes had changed. No longer human, but speckled with glowing points like Proctor's, a transformation that sent my heart plummeting into despair. "Jovek, I see things," he stammered, his voice trembling with terror and awe. "It's inside me." And with those words, the full horror of Stygian Point crystallized. Whatever that place was, it had seeded. Something within him, perhaps within us both, a presence that wouldn't fade simply because we'd crashed through a gate. Desperately, I twisted the key in the ignition, my shaking fingers willing the van to sputter back to life. But the engine remained lifeless, its fuel long depleted, forcing me to confront the device in my hand and the terrible possibility taking shape. That if it was part of Proctor, it might hold the power to halt this nightmare, or conversely, to amplify it beyond imagining. "Stay with me," Lysander pleaded, though the tinnitus swelled to a piercing crescendo that drowned out his words, leaving me torn between the instinct to flee and the dread that moving him might carry this contagion back into the world, a choice that gnawed at my soul as time slipped away. Ultimately, I remained there, staring down the unlit road, the device warm against my palm as Lysander shivered beside me, his hum filling the air with a sound that offered no answers, yet promised an escalating cascade of worse to come, a realization that surviving Oakhaven, the transfers, and the dirty games paled in comparison to Stygian Point, not a prison in the traditional sense, but an infection that had taken root. What had escaped with me was no longer the Lysander I'd once known, and what I held in my hand might be the key to ending this ordeal, or the noose that would tighten around my neck, a horror that hadn't concluded in the garage but had followed, me lurking in the empty sky above, signaling that the true reckoning was still on the horizon, poised to strike when I least expected it.